John sadly died in 2015, and the Federal Trust has taken upon itself the very pleasant duty of organising, particularly at these TEPSA conferences, occasional lectures in commemoration of John. John was one of the people who set up the TEPSA network, and in particular he was very interested in the pre-presidency conferences. I'm very pleased to see Wolfgang Wessels at the back, who I think was very much associated with John in those early pre-presidency conferences, so we thought it appropriate that this should be a venue to commemorate John. He died at a great age in 2015. Those of you who, and his resonance is not just in the United Kingdom. I was recently approached by the Icelandic embassy in London asking me to talk about Brexit, and I said I was very flattered, but why had they come to the Federal Trust? Said the Icelandic diplomat, I was for a long time a pupil of John Pinder's. So it's from the torrid south to the frozen north that the Pinder message goeth forth. He was well known on a international level as well. Those of you who remember him physically will recall that he was a man of a very precise, almost military demeanour. He had a traditional English moustache, although he was very much a proud Scot. He always dressed in a suit. He came of a military background. He used to be very proud of telling his intimates that he could pinpoint the exact date of his conception because his mother happened to be visiting his father in the Sudan, where he was the military governor of a province of the Sudan. And he himself served in the Second World War. It might be possible to draw from this a rather familiar narrative, given his federalist, his internationalist views, a narrative of saying, well, he was someone who reacted against his background, somebody who didn't accept the values and the principles of his parents. I think that would be wrong. I think it would be quite wrong. And for two reasons I say that. The first reason why I say it is that John was in no sense a pacifist. He would have been very happy to have a European defence community. He was much influenced by the fact that before the Second World War, federalism in the United Kingdom was a very influential intellectual movement. Can you hear me at the back? If you want to hear me at the back, yeah. Those who would like to, let me know if they can't. It was a very influential movement, but it was discredited and brought into a lack of prestige precisely by the fact that many people associated with federalism in the United Kingdom in the 1930s were pacifists and were very influential in shaping the British policy of too much accommodation towards the dictators, influenced by the events of the First World War, obviously. But this was something that John was very much aware of and wanted to avoid entirely. He would much have preferred that European integration should have begun, as originally it was intended to begin, with the bringing together of defence policies. For him, the economic model of integration, which is what the European Union has chosen, was a second best. So firstly, I'd like to contradict the idea that John was in any sense a pacifist. But there's also another aspect to the inadequacy of an analysis which says he was rejecting a military background, which was that in many ways his thinking was precisely that of the military mind and the military approach to things. He always used to speak very fondly of his time in the military, and I remember that in 1997 there was the question of the militarization of certain areas of the United Kingdom in order to combat foot and mouth disease. John was very pleased indeed about this because, well, once you give the military people a task, they go off and do it. They don't spend their time asking about whether it's a good idea or not. And I think it's not fanciful to see that in his approach to federalism, there was quite a lot of this military thinking, this idea that people should have specific tasks, people should have chains of command, people should have responsibilities, there should be an agreed goal in a way that is not usual in politics. His federalism, it seems to me, was not federalism for the sake of federalism, but federalism because it incorporated a number of the principles that he found rather precious. Those principles, I think, we would summarize as cooperation, that it was always better for people to work together rather than to be working against each other. But the thought that it was necessary to people to have clear areas of responsibility so that you wouldn't have the problem of some things being done by two people and other things being done by nobody. It was important to have a rational and transparent and rules-based approach to the world. I think there was a paradox that while John was very well aware that the military option is on the international level the denial of rules, it's a substitution of violence for rules, within the military hierarchy, within the military system, it's very much a rules-based system. And I think he was conscious of a similarity between the rules-based system internally of military discipline and military planning compared to the governance ideas which he had. I remember his saying on a number of occasions that he regarded economics, which was his original science, as being very similar to military planning. It was always a question of trying to make use of inevitably limited resources that would subserve, in a cooperative and collaborative effort, the common good. When John talked about rules, of course, he talked very much about the rule of law. And that was something that perhaps was almost the most important aspect to him philosophically of federalism. And his commitment to the rule of law was not just a commitment of an ethical nature, it was also a commitment of a rationalist nature. He valued the predictability of the rule of law as much as he valued its ethical fundament, its ethical underpinning. Now, all this may sound rather high level and rather abstract. John, in addition to being an important political philosopher and analyst, was also very much a political activist. I was very interested to see among his papers in the 1960s a large number of papers that he had written of correspondence with leading politicians of the time, trying to build up a head of steam, a head of enthusiasm for joining the European Union or the European community as it then was. I hadn't fully realized just what an interlocutor he was for all the leading politicians of the day. He also used his policy studies unit as a lobby group, essentially, for making the economic case of Britain's joining the European Union. When we had the first referendum in 1975, John was very active in that and made the case so powerfully that he was awarded an OBE by the Queen later on. He was also somebody regularly consulted by the Foreign Office during those years. And I suspect the reason why he was so regularly consulted by the Foreign Office was that, unusually among high-grade academics, if I may say so, he had an enormous pragmatic and practical streak to him. He always said that it's better to be going in the right direction slowly than going in the wrong direction quickly, or worse, not going anywhere, neither slowly nor quickly. For instance, he was somebody, as I've mentioned, who regretted that there was not a greater communitarization of foreign and defense policy. But he was somebody who was a great supporter, I know, of the institution of the High Representative, because he saw it as being something that would ingrain the habit of cooperation, which would eventually lead to the necessary communitarization and institutionalization, which was the only basis on which predictability, once again that key word for him, could be assured. John would have had and had no time for the idea that the federal impulse within the European Union is dead. I remember his saying on a number of occasions that the European Union would undoubtedly develop into a United States of Europe, but neither he nor anyone listening to him would be alive to see it. And they probably wouldn't recognize it if they could see it, because it would be so different from what we think about the United States of Europe at the moment. And that was very much his sense of the journey, of the process, of its being our obligation to future generations to do what we can to get ourselves further along the right road. An interesting case for him was that of the Eurozone. He very much welcomed the Euro, and he regretted that the United Kingdom didn't join. He was always of the view that one day the United Kingdom would join. And that's still my view, by the way, for what it's worth. And whether it will be after having left the European Union or coming back or never having left, who knows? Or it might even be a bit quicker than some people think if the Brexit negotiations go a particular way that they might go. But one thing he did stress, I remember, on a number of occasions in conversations I had with him, that he always regarded the original governance structures of the Eurozone as being a beginning and certainly not an end. And he much regretted a certain tendency in some countries to regard the what he regarded as rudimentary governance arrangements of the Eurozone as having been set in stone and incapable of further development. I think he freely admitted that he had hoped it would be easier to change those arrangements as time went on than in fact turned out to be the case. John Pinder didn't foresee the outcome of the Brexit referendum. And I've had people say to me that they think it was a blessing that he was spared at his great age that unpleasant surprise. I'm afraid I always disagree with that. He would have been irritated that people like me, who thought there was a real chance of the Brexit referendum going the way it did, had turned out to be right. And he'd be afraid that we would go around telling him, "We told you so. You were too rational about it." That would have been his first reaction, perhaps. But he was a man of immense resilience and emotional stability. He would certainly very rapidly have come to terms with the new situation, and he would have been a very active and enthusiastic critic of the way that the Brexit negotiations were going. Indeed, I think, although he perhaps would have been too polite to say so, he'd have taken some malicious joy in the confusion which inevitably, and this is what I want to end on, which inevitably has surrounded the Brexit negotiations. I remember a phrase of his quoting Horace, or misquoting Horace, was that if you drive out rationality with a pitchfork, it will always return. Horace was talking about driving out nature with a pitchfork, but it will have its way. And I'm sure that John would have seen in the Brexit negotiations the proof of that, that so essentially irrational a course of action as Brexit. I'm not talking about whether it was a good idea to join in the first place, whether the European Union is a perfect or even a desirable organisation. But for Britain to leave now in the circumstances in which it's leaving is something which is logically and rationally, it seems to me, indefensible. And John, I think, would have been rather amused because he had a quiet and even, I might say, slightly malicious sense of humour about these things. He would have taken pleasure in it. And I think he would not have needed to live very much longer than he did to have seen what may well be the collapse of the Brexit negotiations. I'd like to finish on this. The minister said a few minutes ago that the European Union, the rest of the European Union, doesn't know what the British want. Well, that's not true. They know exactly what the British want. The British want to retain all the benefits of the European Union and give up all its disbenefits and responsibilities. What could be clearer than that? Now, they can't get it, and they find it very difficult to come to know or to agree on what they want as an alternative. But I sometimes think that there's a lack of awareness among our European partners, the United Kingdom's partners, of just how deep is the intellectual and political hole into which the United Kingdom, and particularly the Conservative government, has dug itself. The reason, or one of the reasons why I describe Brexit as being irrational in itself, it's not by chance. There aren't good solutions waiting around the corner. It is a bad idea intrinsically, is because there is no alternative that is other than much worse. You may have some choice as a British government as to the form that this much worse takes, but there is nothing that can possibly be as good or even nearly as good. And that's something which psychologically is very difficult for those people in the British government who are engaged in these negotiations to accept. So watch out for the possibility, I would see it, of total collapse of the negotiations, the possibility of another referendum. I once reproached John chidingly with his being too rational. And he said that such a thing is impossible. Well, he would say that as a rationalist. But I do think that rationality was much more important to him than what is sometimes regarded as the ethical impulse of federalism. He was a rationalist. He thought that federalism was the best, the most effective, the most coherent way of going about governance. And he always said that it was the job of people like him, public intellectuals, to be the people who in difficult times, perhaps in impossible times, stood up for what they knew to be the truth. And I think that measured against that criterion, John has been rather successful in leaving a legacy, which I'm very happy to be talking about today, and which I think does have applications. And one of his very distinguished pupils, Jaap van der Zwaan, is going to talk to us about those implications. Thank you for your attention, and I hope if you have any applause, it should be for John just as much as for me.
Lots of papers here. Well, let me start by saying thank you very much, Brendan, for recalling us the very rich legacy of John Pinder. I mean, I know John Pinder as I was his student at the time at the College of Europe. So as a student, you're not so much aware of the status of your lecturer, of his brilliant ideas, his expertise, but nevertheless, in Bruges in the 70s, I got to know John Pinder as an extremely good lecturer, a lot of expertise and experience, with ideas which really were thought through. And he was also very pleasant, because that is the environment in Bruges. After the lecture, he offered you all kind of opportunity to enter into a direct discussion with him, and that was also very enriching in order to become, if you not as yet were a European, to become at least a European. And I think also it's thanks to John Pinder's legacy, as it has been presented at the College of Europe, that the college produces such a huge number of people at least suited to serve the cause of European integration. Now, my role as a sort of moderator of this session is a bit difficult, but on the other hand, it's also up to you to come forward with your comments. And it's my responsibility, if we talk in terms of responsibility, to put a little bit the legacy of John Pinder against the background, sounds a bit odd, of the future agenda. So in a way, I wanted to connect Brendan's expose to the presentation, excellent presentation, of Alexander Schallenberg. Because we have to move forward. And how can the legacy of John Pinder serve to that end? I want just to provoke you a little bit, make some, hopefully, short comments on a number of points. First of all, the issue of federalism. Secondly, democracy. Thirdly, the rule of law. Fourthly, the Eurozone. Then the threats and challenges we are faced with. What does this mean? What is our first priority to deal with? Brexit, why not? And then what would John Pinder have thought of all this? Good. First, federalism. As a lawyer, of course, it's very tempting to analyze deeply what the status of the European Union is all about. I tried that several times, but it's not very useful. It's a rather academic discussion. Everybody should understand the European Union is a union, by the way. We do not call it a political union, but it is a union which has been developed and tailor-made according to the wishes as they have been gradually developing by the political leaders at that moment in time. So it's a process, bottom-up in a way, gradual steps, and on a voluntary basis. And these two characteristics explain for myself a number of the problems we are faced with these days. It's a gradual process. We need a consensus of all the partners in order to make further steps ahead. And it's essentially on a voluntary basis that people do participate in that process. Nevertheless, having said that, I think the Union reflects certain federalist characteristics, as well in the domain of its governance system, but more particularly with regard to the policies. The European Union is engaged in, sometimes, by the way, in a negative manner, public health, education, culture. The Union is supposed not to participate, but essentially the Union is participating in all thinkable policy domains. And you can identify the drawing lines, the dividing lines, what's national competence and what is the European Union competence. The only problem being it's not very transparent. And we desperately need the assistance of the Court of Justice to draw these lines in a very specific and precise manner. There is a governance system as well, functioning relatively well. The difference, however, with purely speaking federalist states like the United States or the Russian Federation, perhaps less the Bundesrepublik, is that the central governance level is very weak. But that does not say that it does not demonstrate federalist characteristics. So for me, I could argue it is a sort of federal entity in which we are cooperating with. However, again, I come back to what I said first. It's a bit of an academic discussion. On democracy, because it's so important, the role of the European Parliament, the discussion about the reforms, the citizens and European elections of May next year, they are important. I think, because I also worked in the practice, I can really argue, and hopefully even convincingly, that the decision-making process of the European Union is organized in a democratic manner. Essentially, when it comes to legally binding measures, decisions, reference to the co-decision, the co-legislative powers, the co-budgetary powers of the European Parliament, by and large, you can really argue it is a democratic system. So I think we should try to lecture sometimes to ordinary people in the streets or wherever they are. So don't blame the European Union always that it's not democratic, we were as a citizen not aware or whatsoever, they didn't consult us. The problem is in legitimacy, which is essentially, for me, a responsibility of national politicians. We are blaming the Commission, not being directly elected, European parliamentarians, they never show up in the national constituencies. But I think essentially the problem of legitimacy is the main issue, and there I see a primary responsibility for national politicians, especially members of the national governments. And I think the citizens have to be served by good communication and accountability. And that's important. I think rightly so, President Macron proposed this idea of democratic conventions. The Commission came forward with citizen dialogues. We are practicing also in TEPSA a number of other variations, town hall meetings and whatsoever you have. That's exactly the idea, to commit and to connect the citizen to what we are doing at the European level. And to that extent, I think the European Parliament elections of next year, they may be a sort of, we can make the balance with regard to the turnout, maybe an indication of the support of the ordinary citizen for what we are doing. My third point is on the rule of law. And as a lawyer, I have been in many cases, legal proceedings, the agent of the Dutch government before the Court of Justice. It's a crucial issue. It's the fundamental values, the reference to Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union. Actually, they translate more or less minimum requirements for membership. There's a lot of discussion going on, and they're going really to certain extremes. Reference was already made by Alexander Schallenberg to Poland and Hungary, but we are confronted with many more problems. Perhaps also in other member states, Romania, Bulgaria, perhaps also in the Netherlands, no problem. But this is really a fundamental issue. I mean, it's the identity explained, translated by these fundamental values of democracy, the rule of law, independent judiciary, etc. And to the extent we are not able to enforce these fundamental values, Europe is in serious problems because we're undermining our own internal structures and proceedings. If the law is not anymore respected, then we are seriously in trouble. Having said that, I salute always the efforts made by the European Commission. The threat regarding Article 7, the nuclear option, is perhaps less appropriate, but the only available instrument we have at the moment. But I sometimes blame the member states not to be more active in this debate. They leave this nasty file at the table of the Commission, more particularly Frans Timmermans' role. He's moving again, a very urgent visit to Poland one of these days. Because of the problem, the reorganization of the judiciary in Poland doesn't meet, according to the Commission, and I think to a large extent I share that opinion, is not in conformity with. Nevertheless, I think this Article 7 procedure is a not appropriate instrument to hit the member state with. What we need is a general system of monitoring all the member states at the same moment in time and allow everybody to come in. And what we need in the end is not a decision of a political framework, which is the Council or the European Council, unanimity needed. I mean, this is not the suitable approach. What we need is an independent authority, and in my perspective, that cannot be in other instance than the court in Strasbourg. There is a reference in the Treaty on the European Union, the Union shall accede to the Convention of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. And I think we have to draw consequences about this intended accession also with respect to this file. It's not Article 7. It should be a proper legal proceeding ending up in an independent judgment by a fully independent international court. Brings me to the Eurozone. And I also consider the introduction of the single currency as a great achievement. When I was a civil servant at the ministry in The Hague at the time, I was involved in the negotiations for the European Political Union. We were not supposed to deal with the negotiations about the economic and monetary union. That was the level playing field for the ministries of finance and the central banks only. So the Foreign Office had not any say in all that. The only thing I can say, we were very jealous on that parallel intergovernmental conference because they produced pages after pages each day of legal treaty text. Everybody knows that to a large extent, introduction of the EMU and more particularly the single currency is the result of the negotiations, Helmut Kohl, François Mitterrand, in order to facilitate the unification of the two Germanys, and that's excellent. However, my view, we introduced the single currency, but I'm a lawyer, I'm not an economist, I'm not a monetary expert, a bit too early. So we could have foreseen the problems in certain member states where economic reforms have not yet taken place, that to commit them to the strong value of the single currency was quite a dangerous kind of adventure. And I think also that by creating the monetary union, we failed to do something, at least the first step approach, towards the development of an economic union. What at least is needed, was needed, and still is needed, much more coordination of basic economic policy, employment policy, salaries, taxation, social rights, pensions, and so on. There is not that much willingness, and I'm a little bit concerned about the future. We're always helping out banks, we're helping out countries, but the citizens do suffer all the time. It's unemployment, lack of economic growth, and so forth, and I think we should do, once we have created not only an internal market, but also a common human space, much more in order to allow an appropriate coordination of economic policies to take place. Alexander Schallenberg has mentioned the very difficult task of the Austrian presidency. The external threats and the internal threats, do not underestimate all that taken together. I think the economics crisis, or what is still the remainder of the economic crisis. The migration is still with us, will be with us. Is it not the first influx, the second? There will be a third one. Perhaps there will be a fourth one. To the extent we are nevertheless a stable continent, not so far away of many, many, many countries and regions in conflict, we will be at very attractive destinations. So migration will stay with us. And in parallel with that, and connecting migration to poverty, conflicts elsewhere in the world, we will be confronted with terrorism as well. We have geopolitical problems at all our external borders. Russia, Ukraine. I consider Turkey in a way also as a problem. The Middle East, the discussions about the Iran deal, Northern Africa, which is still an area of a lot of turmoil. So we are surrounded by problems. And that's, of course, why also the Austrian president refers to securing borders, protect the people. It's one of the elements. And internally, it's the employment economic growth problem, north-south, perhaps also the west and the east. The impact migration has on the national societies, but also perhaps even more particularly on the local societies. Populism, Euroscepticism. Please calculate with me the number of Eurosceptical governments. It really is getting at a rather high level. And obviously the respect of the rule of law. And taken together, this is really something, a very heavy agenda. And I think Alexander Schallenberg mentioned this point. The rule of law is one of the really essential issues. Tusk, by presenting his leaders' agenda, of course, is very ambitious. But I tried to provoke Alexander Schallenberg, but I think the working method from the outset was wrong. He put all the difficult issues in a program with a scenario, with dates, and an ultimate result. At the end of this month, it's a sky-high number of points on the agenda of the heads of state and government at the summit of the end of June. I think this whole working method was not very, very well developed, and it raises expectations not only with the citizen, but also with the civil servants, which simply will not be respected, I think. So I am a bit somber and a bit pessimistic about the outcome of the leader agenda, at least with regard to the short term. What does this mean with regard to the general situation? So the external challenges, the internal threats, or what have you. And again, to a large extent, due to the fact that we have created a wonderful organization through the soft power approach, bottom up, on a voluntary basis, step by step, great achievement. But I think what should be the first priority to deal with? I think, for my part, it is nevertheless in the external domain. It's the reference to defense and it's to foreign policy, the high representative, as was mentioned by Brendan. The need for a true European Union foreign policy. I think that's one of the main issues. The Iran deal, climate change to a certain extent, the trade conflicts, the negotiations, and so on. I mean, that's, I think, one of my first priorities, which I hope that we can make some progress on. Brexit, I've always considered this a file where we have to spend a terrible lot of negative energy. This referendum was badly prepared. The outcome satisfies nobody, I think, except with a small group of extreme Brexiteers, obviously, in the British Parliament and elsewhere. And there was, in fact, only a very narrow vote in favor of leave. It was not the British people who has decided to leave the European Union. It was a very small majority who had decided to do that. If you listen now to the scenarios, I'm sometimes thinking, what are we talking about? Everybody, it's a mutual interest, by the way, want to keep the Brits as close as possible to our own chest. It's a mutual interest for my country, for other member states, for the whole European Union, to have them very close to our heart. The models, nevertheless, which are on the agenda, As far as I know, and also know a little bit the strategy, if there is at all a strategy, are no starters. I mean, the internal market, the EEA, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein are involved in the internal market, but not partner in the customs union. I think Mrs. May and her colleagues have always argued, we do not want to be partner in a customs union. What are we talking about? Because the result the Brits may get is just so far less than what they have now, that at a certain moment, and that momentum should perhaps occur when Parliament has to discuss about the outcome of the negotiations, will come up. So as far as I can see, and as far as I've been involved in certain discussions, perhaps the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, the Ukraine model, might be something. It's not pick and choose, by the way, but it's really a kind of very tight economic relationship. That's what I thought for a while, but a lot can change. That having said, if we are trying to keep them as close as possible to our chest, why not revisit the whole idea? But that's, I hope, my final point, of what John Pinder should have thought about all this. I think he was indeed a real European, a pragmatic federalist with a military background, I have understood more correctly now. His approach obviously was a very good one. Did people not listen to him enough? Was he perhaps a little bit naive? I think we have to realize political reality is a bit different. So political reality is a bit served by the short-term interest by the politicians who are in power. But I think what is lacking these days at all our political levels, and more particularly perhaps at the highest political level, is a degree of vision, how to deal with it. And I hope indeed that with regard to Brexit, and that's my final sentence, Whitehall will take a momentum, perhaps in an early stage, perhaps when the withdrawal agreement will be presented and the perspective of the future relations, we'll have a moment to revisit it and take on board the common sense as has been expressed by John Pinder. So a few points just to stimulate the discussion. It's a bit of everything, but nevertheless, I think in order to bring the legacy to the present situation, the responsibility challenge for the Austrian presidency, I thought I pick and choose some of the most important aspects. But now it's up to you. So to address Brandon, to address the colleagues, because it's an open discussion, and we have far more than half an hour, isn't it, Katrin? So there is lots of time. Who could I invite to take the floor? Should we try to categorize the topics or just come up with spontaneous questions or comments? Who will be the first? If there is no volunteer, I will designate a volunteer. The legacy was clear. My points, hopefully, yes, of course. Yeah. Katrin? Shall we first give the floor to Katrin? Shall I stay here? Or? Yeah, I think it's better to stay here.
Thank you. One of to both of you on your talks. One of the issues that hasn't yet come up that much is another topic or priority of the Austrian presidency that I would like to hear your thoughts on, and maybe sort of through you what John Pinder's thoughts were on this. And namely, that's the topic of subsidiarity. And that is now sort of the demand that the EU focus on what the most important areas are. And the Austrian presidency has a few fairly broad ideas on what these issues should be. So I would like to get your view on this. Is it possible, is it indeed actually desirable to sort of rescale the European Union to the big topics and to leave other things to subsidiarity? And follow up from that is, of course, is that even possible? You know, because past conventions, for example, the Convention on the Future of Europe, where the renationalization of competencies had already been a topic and had proved rather difficult because the opinions on what was a priority issue for the EU differed.
John was always rather ruefully, if you can hear me, rather ruefully surprised that the European Union was a very odd kind of federation, because foreign policy and defence policy are very typically topics for central decision-making. And precisely those are the topics that the European Union at the federal level is weakest in. It is an intergovernmental arrangement. When John talked about subsidiarity, he was always very clear that subsidiarity could go up as well as down, that you might conclude, and this was one of his major themes, that there were issues, such as environmental issues, where it was appropriate in the pursuit of subsidiarity that those decisions should be taken at a more central level than that of the nation state, whereas there were other issues where precisely it was appropriate to devolve downwards. So when he talked about subsidiarity, it was always in a parallel, both upwards and downwards. He would have taken the view, and he definitely took the view, that the way in which the European Union has developed, particularly as far as the internal market is concerned, meant that there weren't enormous areas of European decision-making that ought to go back to the nation states. He didn't think that. What he thought was that if that case could be made, it could only be made when you'd given to the central level those things that belonged at the central level. Because for him, the absence of subsidiarity in the European Union was the failure to have proper mechanisms for things like the currency, defence and foreign policy, which in any federal system are typically the things done at the centre.
Yeah, I think that's my approach as well. So much is linked to each other. It's a process which you hardly can stop. So we started with the internal market. We connected the environmental policy to that. And obviously, because a lot has been concentrated on the external borders of the internal market, but also for free movement of persons, we need an asylum immigration policy. Where is the end? And I also said in my presentation, there are certain references to areas where the Union is supposed not to interfere. So I sometimes would like to challenge those in favor of reasoning, what could these policy domains be? So on the contrary, I did try to do some research about the differentiated cooperation. That's a much more challenging one. But there I'm now experiencing the problem of the fundamental values. So if we want to scale down the level of membership of certain member states because they want to be scaled down with regard to certain areas, the problem is you have to keep on board as a full member only those who respect the minimum requirements for membership. And that is also gradually becoming quite a serious problem. On the other hand, and it's not only to blame new member states, I think that's why my plea for a general monitoring system. We have to be subjected, everybody of us, also the Netherlands and France and Italy and all that, to a monitoring system. I think that is something which we have to recognize. It's very difficult to maintain enforcement of the minimum values, fundamental values, even in a system of differentiated cooperation. You can develop that. And again, I mean, if certain member states want to be scaled down, why not? As long as my minimum approach would be the internal market, believe it or not, common foreign security policy, and I think asylum immigration. Difficult, so to a certain extent, the Norwegians are closer to that minimum level compared to the UK already by now. But that would be my minimum approach, and then, of course, as a preliminary condition, respect of the fundamental values.
It's sometimes said that federalism is dead in the European Union, that the federalist dream has run its course. I'd be interested to know, may I ask, how many people here would agree with that proposition in general, that the federalist dream has run its course? There's nothing
Yes, please.
wrong with saying that. I'm just interested. Yeah.
There is somebody who wants to intervene.
No, but somebody who agrees with that, I think.
Well, he wants to see fingers, but...
Well, perhaps ask questions which demonstrate a reaction.
Yeah, I come from Hungary, from the Institute of World Economics, and you mentioned that it is very sad if Europe cannot force the rule of law on its members. And I think it's, you are right, and it is very sad that this question is at all have been raised. I feel that the European Union was established for something positive aims and not for punishing members, not for forcing members, and that's why it was quite unprepared for the sort of cynical and impertinent misuse of the EU by the Hungarian government, for example. And finally, at last, it seems that the European Commission tries to suggest to bind the European budget, to bind the money to the rule of law. But I see here, I foresee very large, long-lasting, endless debates on this question. And I ask you, as a lawyer, whether you see any kind of concrete, definite tools from the part of the EU or the Commission to...
Yes. We have to go back to the mission of federalism, but let me put it this way. Indeed, to a certain extent, the discussion is a bit dishonest, where we took on board the new member states, but I do not want to make distinctions between classes of member states. We were very well aware. These countries came from far. Okay. It would be a rather tragic event if we fall down of this podium. But we knew very well that they were also in that respect not really well prepared. And it's, of course, a bit of an artificial approach to say after 10 years of membership, you are not living up to your minimum kind of, that's a bit. So my idea is discussion, dialogue, and an independent monitoring system. And to that extent, I must salute the efforts made by Frans Timmermans, because he's always endlessly trying to have a discussion. And with your country, he's much more successful in that compared to the Polish colleagues. But again, we have to spread this discussion not only over a couple of member states, but going back to a general monitoring system, because it's about the fundamental ideas. With regard to consequences, sanctions, and whatsoever, I mean, with regard to the treaty text, Article 7, and I think it's 352 of the Treaty on the Functioning, it's about suspension in the end. I mean, after all these hurdles to be adopted, by the way, at the last instance, unanimity within the European Council, obviously with the exception of the vote of the member state in question. It's about possible suspension of the voting rights. Other consequences, I think, have to be thought about and have to be put on paper and be adopted according to the ordinary procedures. So it's a bit, I think it's difficult to already by now link the cohesion funds to these issues. There has to be built a bridge between them, and that in itself is a file which is very difficult to complete, I think. It's very difficult. So it's dialogue, discussion, and trying to convince the other, and take a bit more time, perhaps. There was the appeal of Brandon, who still believes in this federal mission, and there were two people who showed their hands. Perhaps we can turn to them.
I'm Paul Louis, retired, but still at Vienna University. I don't want to go on this Hungary and Poland bashing. I'm concentrating on federalism. I did a study comparing environmental policy in the European Union and in the United States. And I was somehow shocked that in some aspects, environmental policy is much more centralized in Europe than in the United States. Somehow the European Union is a federalism, but the problem is that, well, to make it very comprehensive, the European Union is a French invention, and the French the French don't understand decentralization, federalism, subsidiarity. So inbuilt in the European Union is quite a lot of centralization. And as in the United States, although in the European Union, the Court of Justice is very much centralizing. So this is one problem. The second problem is that although the European Parliament gets more and more powers, the turnout in the elections is lower and lower. So the big problem in the European Union is, in my opinion, you have some kind of federal system, but the legitimization of this federal system is relatively weak. So the European Union has to be very careful to not create more and more resentment among population, people who think they are not so well off and fear that the involvement of Brussels is so strong and there's no legitimization. And still one point, as a Central European, I always say Western Europe doesn't understand Central Europe. And this is my point with Hungary and Poland. Thank you.
Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, if I may, because it's very relevant for what John Pinder used to say. He would reject very much the idea that the European Union is a French creation. He would insist that it's a German and Italian creation because his ideas about federalism come very much from those sources rather than from France. For instance, before Britain joined the European Union, he wrote a number of very, very dismissive and critical books about Gaullism and the French attitude towards the European Union. He was always very much against the intergovernmentalism of the French. When I talked about his rejection or his repentance, his sadness that there wasn't more in the way of federalization of foreign policy and defense policy, he'd always tell you that's the fault of the French, you know. So I think I'd say I must, in justice to his legacy, talk about that. As far as the European Parliament is concerned, I think it goes back to something that Jaap says. The way that national parliamentarians and national politicians are very reluctant to speak well of the European Parliament. I think that's very important. But I do agree with you entirely about legitimacy, and this was something on which I did have conversations with John. I thought that John, candidly speaking, had too formalistic a view of this. That because the elections took place, because you could vote the way you wanted, because you had a choice, because you knew roughly what people would be standing for, therefore that was a functioning parliamentary system. I thought that was over-optimistic and over-formalistic. I do very much welcome, personally, and so did John, the proposal that the identity of the President of the European Commission should come about as a result of the European Parliament election. Because that is something that people are voting for, and their votes can make a difference. Mm-hmm. More generally, the question of resentment, I think, does go back to the poor functioning of the Eurozone. I think that when we had the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the European Union was not seen by many people as being part of the solution. It was either seen as being irrelevant to the consequences or even making things worse. I don't think that was always fair, but it was a widespread perception. So I'm not sure that there is anything that the European Union needs to do other than to get its Eurozone governance right. That's my view, that if that's got right, then a lot of other things will fall into place.
Ramunas?
Thank you. Petr Kratochvíl, Institute of International Relations in Prague. Well, I'm a federalist.
Oh, sorry.
It's fine. am federalized in my mind and heart. So the answer, my answer as a normative ideal would be yes. But of course, if we look at the region, and I'm not only partially talking about Austria, but more about the Visegrad 4 and the situation there, the real question is not federal or intergovernmental EU, but staying or leaving, really. And I'm really not exaggerating, because one opinion poll after another in the Czech Republic says that that there still is a majority in favor of staying, but the majority is like very close to Brexit opposite, like 53, 47, 55, 45, something like that. And it seems to me that we had this period of post-communism, and now we have in the Visegrad 4 the period, I believe it's a kind of cycle of identity politics, and it's very strong there. This whatever Brussels does, and I agree with you, it can be just anything. Still, there will be some media outlets, some policymakers who will just accuse Brussels of either meddling or not doing enough. Either or. So it's always the scapegoating Brussels. And the good news there, I think, is that the young people below 30 are very strongly in favor of staying. But I think that we somehow have to survive this, but it's a long period of time, I mean, like 20 years, before they become the voting majority. And I'm really worried that if we survive this period as Central Europeans in the EU or outside, and of course, I realize that every time when I talk to students, because I give lectures to high school students as well, I always end up with there where the Remainers in Brexit campaign ended up with, and that's the rational arguments very much about economy, and then you are confronted with this identity politics and the fears and securitization of migration, and then suddenly I'm at a loss, right, what to say there. And so as I say, I'm very much in favor of future federal Europe, but I'm really worried about the current state of Central Europe, and I'm not talking only about Poland and Hungary. And then perhaps I had a very short, brief second question, because I noticed that in the last week there were at least 2 or 3 articles in The Guardian talking about the U-turn in the public opinion in the UK, and about how the Remainers now lead by something like that %, and all end up with calling for the second referendum. And of course, correspondingly, the Daily Mail and others become more and more hysterical. So my question is that, is there any chance of a second referendum? Thank you.
I know what you mean by talking about being blamed for everything. During the referendum campaign, there were 2 important strains of argument. One of which was that the European Union and the European Commission in particular was a socialist bureaucratic plot. The other of which was that it was a neoliberal plot of the capitalist bankers. And those 2 arguments existed very happily, and people voted for whatever reason that they liked. John, one of the last conversations I remember having with him, I think it was a very powerful point he made. People talk about national identity. My national identity, my British national identity, has got nothing to do with most of the things that are put forward by the people who most want to leave the European Union. I am in favour of tolerance, I'm in favour of parliamentary rule, not of autocracy, not of demagogy. I'm in favour of a mixed society, of a tolerant society, an open society. I'm in favour of open trading. I think that the politicians, national politicians, ought to be rather more optimistic about the identity that their electors have. Of course, there is a certain tranche of the electorate which will say, yes, keep foreigners out, keep hoodlums out, we need more severe punishments. In the United Kingdom, it has been established that the best indication of how people would vote was whether they were in favour of the death penalty in the referendum. If you were in favour of the death penalty, you voted for Brexit. If not, not. And it is very much linked to social attitudes. But politicians ought to be, in my view, particularly since many of them themselves share these more generous and liberal attitudes, to have more confidence in saying, well, I don't want to have my national identity taken away from me, but the people who are taking it away from me are not the Commission, it's people like UKIP.
Mm-hmm. And you were really sure to talk in behalf of the 4 countries, because I've seen also opinion polls in Hungary, for example, where there was quite an huh?
Yeah, surprisingly more
positive. Well, very much more positive.
One or two others I noticed, Roderick Contin and...
Who, Catherine, would you no?
Roderick.
Who else would
a gentleman
come on board? Yes, please.
My name is Wolfgang Nietzsche, and I'm with the Federal Ministry of Finance, and I have probably a close to philosophical question. I mean, when the European Union was founded in the mid-50s, the narrative was crystal clear. It was an institution preserving peace, and given the traumatic experience of World War II, that was quite logic, and that led to that what we call permissive consensus. It was clear for everybody it's a peace-keeping institution, dear to the heart of everybody, and then the practical implementation of integration was left to the technocrats. Integration was always an elite project. So, then in the 80s, 90s, that permissive consensus diminished, went down. Why? It's logic, because war became a quite remote possibility in Europe. And so I have a very simple question. What do you think could be the new narrative, nearly as convincing as the peacekeeping narrative, which could justify the deepening, the further deepening of European integration towards a federalistic structure? Thank you.
Well, the European Union does have a federalistic structure. It's more a question of justifying what that structure is, if I understand you. And I don't think myself that in the world in which we live at the moment, Russia, the United States, migration, the unresolved questions of the Eurozone, I think there are plenty of things that Europe could and should be doing better at the European level. See, I don't think it's a question of coming up with a narrative. I think it's a question of coming up with successes and with achievements. And if you can demonstrate that on questions like migration, the Eurozone, international trade, relations with the United States and with Russia, the European Union is making a contribution to those things going better, then you won't have any difficulty in convincing the electorate and people in the countries that this is a good idea. It's Europe's position in the world, both domestically and internationally, that really must be the answer to that question, mustn't it?
Let me say on this topic, for me the turning point was not in the 80s, but essentially it is the Treaty of Maastricht. After all these historic events taking place, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the application for membership, and we added to the program, which was economic in essence, many other topics. I mean, when I was a civil servant at my foreign office, we were working on the internal market, mutual recognition of diploma, all kinds of standards and whatsoever. What was good for Europe was good for the Netherlands, but also for the other member states. We were, of course, in a smaller group of member states, but we were the more like-minded, perhaps. But what was good for Europe was good for the member states. Since Maastricht, obviously, justice, home affairs, a common foreign security policy, and economic monitoring has complicated the agenda quite a lot. Nevertheless, if you would like to have a new narrative, I mean, that's also very nice and a little bit academic, but nevertheless, vis-à-vis the citizen, what to think about stability and security? Just taking inspiration of the motto of the Austrian presidency, a union to protect, stability and security. I don't know, take it for what it's worth. We have a couple of minutes, perhaps.
Roderick, I think.
Oh, Roderick.
Roderick gave the last speech.
Sorry, yes. We must indeed salute Roderick, because he provided the first Pinder lecture, and I really recommend you to read it or reread it again, because it was an excellent expose, which he delivered, by the way, in his own capital, which is, well, in Malta. So we were happy to listen to you, and certainly also happy to have your intervention now.
Thank you, first of all. I want to answer the question which was provocatively put by Brendan about the future of federalism and the European Union. Well, I want to propose that really there cannot be a European Union without a federation. I mean, if we want a confederation of states, it's nearly what we have. If we want really to achieve some kind of unity, it has to be on the basis of a federation. Now, federation, unfortunately, has been denigrated for so many years that it has lost currency, and it will die because there will be no one left to defend it. So it's getting there, which is very important. And in Europe, I have noticed throughout the course of European integration two very important things. First of all, we expect quick results. We want to achieve the federation quickly. In actual fact, many federations are still struggling with constitutional foundations, long-established federations like Canada in the 19th century, Australia, the United States of America itself took more than 100 years to form. So we in Europe have to be patient to see that it's a long-term process where we have to also try to change the political culture. And in changing the political culture, I think something that we have not mentioned today is the social dimension. There has to be a clear message to the citizens that there is something in the European Union for me in terms of improved welfare, in terms of improved life, and so forth.
Employment.
And governance, of course. I mean, I mentioned earlier, this is a slight digression from what I want to say, but to a colleague, look, my country, when I was campaigning for my country to enter the European Union, we thought we were entering a security community, in the sense, a community of democratic states, where, of course, any kind of threats to our constitutional and democratic institutions would more or less disappear. I was too naive at the time. I would have, I'm disappointed in this case, that the Copenhagen criteria, for example, are an entry ticket. Once you're in, you can do whatever you like. I mean, you can, break up the stadium if you want to. The importance is to get in. So we want to show something to the citizen, and if we want to end this wave of populism, we need to give back to the citizens that kind of hope, that kind of belief in Europe, not disbelief in their own country, but a belief in their own country and in Europe as well. Many people are today have a huge belief in their own country, but have lost all hope in Europe. So that is very, I think, important. And the social dimension has to be part of the discussion on the future of Europe. With respect to defense, I'm very sorry. I am a bit skeptical. I mean, it's like asking clowns not to be clownish anymore. Let me give you an example. For instance, at the moment we have a problem in the Middle East on Iran, where we want to keep the agreement with Iran. Iran would want to keep it. But at the same time, many of our countries, not mine, but many European countries, are selling arms to their arch rivals and enemies in the region, to Saudi Arabia. Now, what kind of foreign policy can we build, really, realistically now? Because this has been said over and over again from the 60s down to the present. What kind of joint foreign policy can we build together in reality if we are saying one thing and doing quite the opposite what kind of normative or moral leadership do we give to other countries which understand, you know, the Arab states and the states of the Middle East are not naive. They understand our motives and what really is motivating certain decisions.
Okay. Right. The final sentence is for Brendan. Well, perhaps 2 or 3.
I certainly agree that it's trade policy rather than classical foreign policy where we can make a difference to the world and teach our citizens that we offer them something. I come back to what I think was the fundamental wrong turning for the European Union, which was the reaction to the Eurozone crisis in 2008. For the first time, lots of people in the European Union thought being in the European Union brings a cost to me personally. They weren't always right about that, by the way, but a lot of them thought it. And I think that it must primarily be in settling the unresolved problems of the Eurozone that the European Union is going to make its next step forward or not. I'm quite optimistic, but I see that there are risks, and I think that John Pinder would have been very happy to read Mrs. Merkel's interview in response to Macron, but he would have said it's only the first step.
Yes, believe in it, gradual approach. Yeah. Well, we have to leave it there. I think that was an excellent takeoff for the further discussions in the workshop. Thank you very much to Brendan. And thank you for your input.